For 8 years, Brad Pitt believed that silence was his shield. He thought that if he didn't fight the headlines, didn't correct the rumors, and didn't attack back, he could save the one thing that mattered most, his family. He believed that quiet endurance was the ultimate form of protection, but he was wrong. In 2025, that silence wasn't rewarded, it was shattered. And it wasn't shattered by the media, but by the very people he was trying to protect. It started with a leaked Instagram post from his son Pax, labeling him a world-class despicable person who made his 4 youngest children tremble in fear. Then came the legal filings. Shiloh petitioning a court to remove Pitt from her name, Maddox testifying against him. One by one, the message was sent, loud and clear. You are no longer our father. If you think this is just another celebrity divorce, look closer. This is the systemic erasure of a Hollywood icon's legacy. It is a story fueled by a $500 million war over a French vineyard, a confrontation at 30,000 feet that involved the FBI, and an emotional chasm so wide it may never be bridged. The silence is finally over. This is the story of what really happened behind those closed doors. This is the cost of the war between Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. And this is why he finally decided to speak. To understand the explosion of 2025, we have to understand the vacuum that preceded it. For nearly a decade, Brad Pitt lived inside a silence that felt almost supernatural. In an era where celebrities fight their battles on Twitter and Instagram, engaging in real-time warfare with public opinion, Brad did the opposite. He ghosted the narrative. He didn't offer explanations. He didn't issue rebuttals to the tabloid covers that painted him as a villain. He simply disappeared into the background of a story that kept evolving without him. Every time a paparazzi photo surfaced during those years, Brad walking alone, head down, hands buried deep in his pockets, the world projected their own theories onto him. Some saw guilt, some saw regret, others saw a man rapidly aging under the weight of something unspoken. But according to sources deeply familiar with his inner circle, this absence wasn't a PR strategy. It wasn't a calculated move to garner sympathy. It was survival. The louder the accusations became, the quieter he felt he needed to be. He was navigating a life where every word he spoke could be used as ammunition in a custody hearing. So, he chose to say nothing. But silence is heavy. And as the years passed, that silence didn't just protect him. It hardened. It calcified into a wall of distance. Not just distance from the public eye, but distance from the very people who once defined his universe. While he stayed quiet, the world moved on. The narrative was written for him, not by him. And in that void, a new reality took shape, one where he was gradually, methodically written out of the family portrait. To understand how the dream died, we have to go back to where the fantasy began. The year was 2003. The set was Mr. and Mrs. Smith. It is almost impossible to overstate the magnitude of what happened when Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie crossed paths. They stood on opposite sides of a personal crossroads. Brad was the golden boy of American cinema. One half of a marriage to Jennifer Aniston that the public viewed as American royalty. Angelina was the dark horse, the rebel, fresh out of a marriage to Billy Bob Thornton. Their chemistry wasn't just good acting, it was a force of nature. Every camera lens magnified it. Might please mark class of comedy ad prediction, Ron Serve. The media began constructing a narrative of forbidden love long before either of them fully understood what was happening. When Brad and Jennifer finalized their divorce in 2005, the world treated it like a scandal. But then came the photograph. Brad, Angelina, and young Maddox playing on a beach in Kenya. To them, it was a private moment of bonding. To the world, it was confirmation. It was the birth of Brangelina. For the next decade, they weren't just a couple. They were a movement. They built a family that captivated the globe. Maddox from Cambodia, Zahara from Ethiopia, Pax from Vietnam. Then the biological children, Shiloh, followed by the twins, Knox and Vivienne. 6 children, different origins, different stories, all woven into a single tapestry of unity. Magazine covers dubbed them the Model International Family. They were the symbols of modern compassion, diversity, and humanitarian purpose. But perfection is a heavy burden to carry. According to later accounts from staff and close friends, maintaining that image while raising 6 children across multiple continents was grueling. It was a life of constant motion. Private jets, security details, conflicting schedules, and the relentless, unblinking eye of the paparazzi. They were living inside a golden cage. From the outside, it looked like paradise. But on the inside, the pressure was quietly building. Cracks were forming in the foundation, long before the public ever saw the house fall down. In 2008, they tried to anchor themselves. They needed a sanctuary, a place where the noise of Hollywood couldn't reach them. They found it in Correns, France. Château Miraval. They purchased the estate for approximately $28 million. It wasn't just a house, it was a kingdom. Vast vineyards stretching across the soft sunlight of Provence. Forests where the children could run without security guards hovering over their shoulders. A recording studio, a chapel. To Brad, Miraval was more than real estate. It was a passion project. He poured millions into renovating the property and, more importantly, into the wine. He partnered with the Perrin family, legendary French winemakers, to turn Miraval into a legitimate business. And it worked. Their rosé became a global bestseller. Miraval was supposed to be there forever. It was the place where they could almost pretend they were ordinary. In 2014, they cemented that promise. They married in the chapel on the estate. It was an intimate ceremony. The children drew colorful artwork on Angelina's veil. Pax baked the cake. They exchanged vows with only their family as witnesses. For a brief, shimmering moment, it looked like peace had finally taken root. It seemed they had escaped the curse of Hollywood marriages. But peace, especially peace built on such high stakes, is fragile. The vineyard that was meant to be their sanctuary was slowly transforming into something else. It was becoming an asset, a ledger, and soon, a battleground. Because just 2 years after that wedding in the chapel, the family would board a plane in France, and when they landed in Los Angeles, the dream of Miraval would be over. History often turns on a single day. For Brad Pitt, that day was in September 2016. The family was aboard a private jet, flying from France back to the United States. What happened at 30,000 feet remains one of the most disputed and analyzed events in celebrity history. But the consequences are undeniable. According to FBI documents and later legal filings, tensions had been simmering for months. But in the confinement of the cabin, the pressure cooker exploded. Reports suggest Brad had been drinking. An argument with Angelina allegedly escalated. Maddox, then just 15 years old, stepped in to defend his mother. Accounts diverged sharply here. Angelina described what she believed was physical aggression, claiming Brad grabbed her, shook her, and that there was a physical confrontation involving Maddox. Sources close to Brad vehemently denied the allegations of abuse, insisting the interaction never crossed the line into physical harm. But in the eyes of the law, the perception of danger was enough to trigger a cascade of federal protocols. Because the incident occurred in international airspace, it wasn't a matter for the local police. It was a matter for the FBI. When the plane touched down, the authorities were notified. The Los Angeles Department of Child and Family Services opened an immediate inquiry into the safety of the children. Think about the weight of that. One moment, you are the world's most beloved father. The next, you are the subject of an FBI investigation. Brad underwent interviews, drug and alcohol testing, and supervised visits. For weeks, his life was dismantled and examined under a microscope. Eventually, both the FBI and the DCFS concluded their investigations. No charges were filed. There was insufficient evidence to pursue a criminal case. Legally, Brad was cleared. But the damage was no longer legal. It was emotional, and it was catastrophic. Angelina filed for divorce days later, citing irreconcilable differences. The trust within the family unit hadn't just fractured, it had been incinerated. The incident on the plane became the defining trauma, the patient zero of the estrangement that would follow. The years that followed the divorce filing weren't characterized by a loud explosion, but by a slow, agonizing erosion. Brad stopped drinking immediately after the plane incident. He committed to sobriety in 2016, attending Alcoholics Anonymous for 18 months. He later described it as a reckoning, a moment where he had to face his demons to save what was left of himself. He hoped that sobriety and time would repair the bridge to his children. He was wrong. The distance grew, mile by emotional mile. Maddox was the first to drift beyond reach. By 2021, reports surfaced that he had testified in a custody hearing, giving statements that were described as not favorable to Brad. Leaked documents suggested he wanted to legally remove Pitt from his name. To Brad, this wasn't just teenage rebellion, it was a rejection of his lineage. Then, the digital footprint of the trauma emerged. In 2020, on Father's Day, Pax posted a message to his private Instagram story. Over a photo of Brad receiving an Oscar, he wrote words that would haunt the actor for years. "You have made the lives of those closest to me a constant hell," he claimed. The younger children trembled in his presence. The post was deleted, but the internet never forgets. The younger children, who Brad had hoped to shield, began to make their own choices. Shiloh, the first biological child, the baby whose birth was a global event. In May 2024, on her 18th birthday, she didn't celebrate with a party. She walked into a courthouse and filed a petition to legally change her name to Shiloh Jolie. Vivienne followed suit, symbolically dropping the name in the playbill for the Broadway show she worked on with her mother. Knox remained silent, but notably distant. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a pattern, a cascade of departures. While Brad retreated into solitude in his sculpting studio, Angelina built a new ecosystem. She created a world of purpose and protection where she was the anchor. Maddox moved to South Korea for university. Pax stayed close to his mother. The children became a unit that functioned entirely without Brad. They didn't just move out. They moved on. While the emotional war was being fought in silence, the financial war was being fought with scorched earth tactics. Miraval. The site of their wedding became the centerpiece of a lawsuit so complex and bitter it rivals any corporate thriller. The conflict exploded when Angelina sold her 50% stake in the winery, but she didn't sell it to Brad. She sold it to a subsidiary of the Stoli Group, controlled by Russian billionaire Yuri Shefler. Brad was blindsided. He sued, claiming they had a verbal agreement that neither would sell their interest without the other's consent. He argued that Angelina had secretly sold her share to a stranger with poisonous associations, purely to inflict harm on the business he had built. Angelina's team fired back with a narrative that redefined the dispute. They claimed she had tried to sell to Brad, but talks collapsed because Brad demanded she sign a sweeping, non-disclosure agreement, an NDA designed, in her words, to silence her about the abuse allegations from 2016. Suddenly, the vineyard wasn't about wine anymore. It was about controlling the narrative. Brad accused Shefler of a hostile takeover. Angelina accused Brad of looting the company assets to pay for vanity projects like a swimming pool and a recording studio renovation. By 2024, the legal fees alone were astronomical. Documents flew back and forth demanding receipts for everything from wine barrels to private jet logs. Miraval was no longer a home. It wasn't even a business. It was a $500 million evidence exhibit. It stood as a physical monument to everything they had built together, now being torn apart, brick by brick, by lawyers in suits. A love story turned into a ledger. A dream turned into a deposition. And where was Brad? Amidst the chaos of court filings and name changes, he was in Santa Barbara. According to those who know him, Brad's life in 2024 and 2025 looks nothing like the superstar existence of the early 2000s. The parties are gone, the drinking is gone. He spends his days in a studio, sculpting. He works with plaster, wood, and bronze. He has described art as a way to physically wrestle with his emotions, to give shape to the grief he cannot speak. He is reportedly engaged to Inés de Ramón, a jewelry executive who has become a grounding presence in his life. Sources say she is the first person since the divorce with whom he has felt safe enough to build a future. But even with new love, a part of him remains suspended in the past. He is a man waiting for a door to open that may be locked forever. He has watched his children grow up through the lens of paparazzi photos and legal updates. He missed the birthdays, the graduations, the small moments that make up a life. He rebuilt his health. He rebuilt his career with a massive Formula One movie project. He rebuilt his finances, but he could not rebuild the bridge to his children. Then in May 2025, the stillness cracked. Brad Pitt agreed to a cover story with GQ. It was his first true, in-depth reckoning with the public since the divorce began. The world expected anger. They expected a defense strategy. They expected him to attack the narrative that had erased him. Instead, they got resignation. His voice in the interview wasn't defensive. It wasn't proud. It wasn't desperate. It was tired. It was the voice of a man who had finally stopped running from the storm and allowed it to wash over him. He spoke calmly about the divorce being finalized in December 2024. He didn't spin it. He just said it was something that needed to be done. When the interviewer gently pressed about the estrangement, about the children dropping his name, about the accusations, Brad didn't fight back. He didn't criticize Angelina. He didn't criticize the kids. He simply said, "I'm always here if they need their father." As in, 7 words. But they carried the weight of 8 years. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't an apology. It was an open hand, a standing invitation that acknowledged the reality. He cannot force them to come back. He can only leave the light on. He admitted to his past mistakes without dwelling on them. He spoke of his sobriety not as a victory, but as a necessity. What happened, happened, he said. This was not a man looking for redemption in the eyes of the public. He no longer cared what the public thought. He was looking for peace. Today, the dust has largely settled, but the landscape is forever changed. The lawsuits are winding down, the headlines are fading. Maddox is in Asia, Pax is forging his own path. Shiloh, Vivienne, and Knox are stepping into adulthood with new names and new identities. Angelina is continuing her global work. And Brad is still there. He sculpts, he gardens, he loves. He waits. The greatest distance in Brad Pitt's life isn't measured in miles or in the dollars lost in a lawsuit. It is measured in silence. Silence between a father and the children he no longer gets to raise. Silence between the memories of what was and the reality of what is. Silence between the man he was on that plane and the man he has become today. This story doesn't have a Hollywood ending. There is no grand reunion scene before the credits roll. This is life. It is messy, it is painful, and it is unresolved. Brad Pitt has finally spoken. The silence is broken. But the future now belongs to the voices he hopes. One day, it will speak back. What do you think? Is there a path back for a family fractured this deeply? Or are some wounds simply too deep to heal? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to understand the full psychological breakdown of other Hollywood tragedies, click the video on your screen right now.